The bell over the pawnbroker's door in Weatherby Lane did not ring so much as apologize. A thin brass complaint that always sounded to Honora like a small animal being asked to speak in company. She stepped in from the November cold, with the last of her jewel case pressed against her ribs beneath her cloak, and she made herself stand still a moment inside the door, because she had learned that a large woman coming through a small door too fast was a spectacle, and she had no patience left for spectacles today. The shop was warm in the wrong way, warm from a stove that had been burning cheap coal too long, and the smell was of oil and old velvet and the tin dust of coins counted too often. Behind the counter Mr. Peabody stood with the particular patience of a man who had bought Honora's mother's pearls, and after them the sapphire brooch, and after them the garnet cross she had worn at her wedding, and after them a christening cup with the wrong initials on the base which he had priced very kindly. There was one thing left in the case. She had known it since dawn, and she had known it a week, and she had known it, if she were honest, since Charles had gone into the ground 18 months before, with a note in his pocket for a debt she did not yet understand, and a smile she still could not stop seeing. And she opened her fingers now, and set the little cracked leather box on the counter between them. "Mrs. Ashcombe," said Peabody, in a voice not unkind. "The last, Mr. Peabody," she said. "I shall not trouble you again." He did not answer at once. He turned the box slowly, as one turns a thing that is heavier than it looks, and he set his thumb on the catch, and the lid rose with the small gasp of a hinge kept oiled by memory alone, and there, against the frayed silk, lay her mother's earrings, the tiny drops of aquamarine that had, in the light of a summer window when Honora was 7, looked exactly the color of the sea, seen through a fair sky, which she had never in her life actually stood beside. But listen, child, because this is where the story begins, though Honora did not yet know it. A story does not always start where the heroine thinks it starts. Sometimes it starts on the day she believes she is finally done with beginnings. Peabody was reaching for his loop when the bell coughed again behind her, and the cold of the street came in, with a man who did not belong in Weatherby Lane, and Honora knew it without turning, because the whole shop changed. The dust in the air seemed to settle. Peabody's hand stopped over the earrings. Somewhere in the back, a clock which had been ticking too loudly ticked more quietly, as though it too were embarrassed to be caught in company. She turned because she had to. And there, in the doorway of Mr. Peabody's pawn shop, in a coat that had cost more than the freehold of the shop entire, stood Julian Marwood, the Duke of Harrowmere, whom she had last seen at 22 across the width of a ballroom, whom she had married someone else instead of, and who was looking at her now with an expression she could not read because she had trained herself over 11 years not to read that expression on any man's face. "Honora," he said. "Not Mrs. Ashcombe. Not madam." Not the polite space one keeps between a duke and a stout widow with wet snow on the hem of her cloak. Her first name, plain, as though he had said it earlier in the day, and was only picking the sentence up again. She had rehearsed, in her head, every version of meeting him again, except this one. She had rehearsed the ballroom version, and the church version, and the version at somebody else's wedding, and in each of them she had been thinner, or at least standing behind something, and in none of them had she been about to sell her mother's earrings for coal money. "Your Grace," she said, and inclined her head, because manners were the last thing she owned outright. He looked at the counter. He looked at Peabody. He looked at the little cracked box, and Peabody, sensible man, had already begun to close the lid, but Julian's eyes had caught the aquamarine and held it, and Honora saw, precisely, the moment he understood. It was not pity. Pity she could have borne, or at least survived. It was worse than pity. It was recognition. He had come into the shop knowing. "Mr. Peabody," said Julian, without taking his eyes off her, "I regret the intrusion. Mrs. Ashcombe and I have a matter of family business we had thought to settle at her house." She had forgotten I was expected. If you would be so good as to keep the box under the counter until she calls again, I should be very obliged. Peabody was too old and too clever to argue with the Duke. The box vanished. A cup of tea materialized in its place, on the counter in a chipped saucer, as though tea had always been the reason for the visit. Honora had a wild moment in which she thought she might laugh, and a wilder one after it, in which she thought she might cry. And she did neither, because she had promised herself years ago that she would do neither in public ever again. "I am not," she said quietly to Julian, "in a position to receive callers, Your Grace." "I have not called," he said. "I have followed. There is a difference. I should like to walk you home, if you will permit it. My carriage is at the corner. It is cold, and I do not think you have eaten." She had not, in fact, eaten, but she was not going to concede the point. She looked at him across the counter, at the fine gray coat, at the shadow under his eyes that she had not remembered from 11 years ago, and she said, "How did you know I was here?" "Later," he said. "Now," said Honora. He almost smiled. She saw it, the very edge of it, quickly folded away. "You always did set your terms first," he said. "Very well. My steward at Marwood has been sent, once a month for a year, to inquire, quietly, after your circumstances. Yesterday he came back with the information that a woman answering your description had sold a sapphire brooch to this shop 3 weeks ago, and had been seen entering it this morning with what he judged, from her carriage, to be the last of a small case. I came directly. I did not know, until I opened that door, that it was you. I hoped it was not." She could not for a moment breathe. Not with the corset, not with the shop, not with the news that for a year, 1 year, she had been walked past by strangers who reported on her to a house she had never entered. "You have been having me watched," she said. "I have been having you kept in view," he said, and the small correction was so precisely him, so exactly the man she remembered making distinctions at a dinner table while other men shouted, that something in her chest turned over painfully. "There is a difference. I do not know your affairs. I know only that you have been living, and I have been unable to be easy until I knew that." "Why?" she said later. He said again, and this time, it was not evasion. It was the voice of a man who could not do a certain sentence in a pawn shop, with Mr. Peabody trying not to hear it. "Come, Honora, my carriage." She went. Handa, we're men. She could tell you now, sitting where you sit, why she went. And she could give you 5 reasons, but the true reason was that she was tired, and she was cold, and the earrings were safe under the counter, and for the first time in 18 months a decision had been taken out of her hands, and she had not known, until that moment, how heavy her own hands had become. The carriage was black, and the horses were black, and the crest on the door had been half concealed by a plain leather cover, which touched her more than she cared to admit. He handed her up himself, and she felt the coach rock under her weight, and did not look at him, because she had spent 11 years training herself not to look at men when she stepped into and out of things. And he did not, thank God, pretend it did not rock. "Where do you live?" he asked when the door was shut. "Number 4, Peel Terrace," she said. "Off the coach road, behind the chapel." "I know it," he said, which was a lie, gracefully told, because no Duke of Harrowmere had ever known Peel Terrace, and she almost forgave him for it. They rode in silence for a full minute. Then he said, without looking at her, "Charles left you nothing." "Charles left me debts," she said, "and a good name that turned out to be paid for on credit. But nothing was, I think, kinder than what he left several other people." She had not meant it to come out as dry as it did. She saw him take it in and file it, and she saw him decide not to smile, which she was grateful for. He said only, "The house rented? The rent is due Friday." I had thought the earrings would meet it and leave a little over for coal. I do not, she added, because pride was the last thing she owned outright, and she had decided on the pavement to keep it. Require you to solve this, your grace. I require you to tell me why you have been watching my door for a year. You will not like the answer, he said. I have not liked an answer in some time. Try me. He was silent so long she thought he might refuse. The carriage turned into the coach road. The lamps of a chalk house slid past the window and gilded, for a heartbeat, the side of his face, and she noticed then how thin he had grown at the temple, and how the gray at his hairline was not evenly distributed, and she thought, with a small, unwilling ache, that he did not sleep either. Because, said Julian at last, I have been in love with you since the season of 1813, and I have made an entire life out of not saying so. And 11 months ago, I heard that Charles Ashcombe had died leaving you destitute, and I have been trying, ever since, to think of a way to enter your rooms that would not humiliate you, and I have failed. So I am, apparently, humiliating you in a pawnshop instead. He did not look at her when he said it. He said it to the carriage window, as though the sentence had needed somewhere neutral to land. Honora, who had not, in 11 years, been described as loved, sat very still, and considered several answers and discarded them all. Your Grace, she said finally, and her voice was steadier than she was, that is a great deal to say to a woman who has just tried to sell her mother's earrings for £6.10. I know, he said, and it is a great deal to say to a woman who last saw you in her uncle's ballroom in a gown that no longer fits. The gown, he said still to the window, was pale green, and you were not at that moment laughing, which was why I noticed you at all, since everyone else was. And I have never understood why laughing rooms are considered good company. I have never once, Honora, thought of you in terms of what did or did not fit. The carriage stopped. She had not noticed them reaching Peel Terrace. The lamp outside number 4 was, as usual, unlit, because she had not been able to afford oil for it, and she saw him note this, and say nothing, and she was, for the second time in an hour, unable to breathe correctly. Come in, she said before she could think about it. The parlor is cold. I cannot offer you anything. But if you have said this much, you had better say the rest indoors, because I will not have my neighbors, watching a duke, sit in a carriage outside my door for an hour. Thank you, he said, quite formally, as though she had offered him supper at a house of state, and he handed her down again, and the small courtesy of not commenting on the second rocking of the carriage was in that moment worth more to her than the £6.10. Her parlor was cold, and she had been right to warn him. It had one lamp lit, at economy, and the fire was down to a scatter of embers under a piece of turf, and there were 3 books on the little table because she had been rereading them, one at a time because they were the only 3 she had left, and a piece of mending on the arm of the chair because she took in mending now, quietly, from a woman in the next street who knew her by her mother's name and asked no questions. Julian took all of this in with the same steady, careful looking with which he had, once she remembered now, taken in a room at her uncle's house, and she had a sudden clear memory of him at 24, standing by a bookshelf, and running his finger along the spines, and she had thought at the time that he was estimating their worth, and had learned since, and only now, that he had been reading them. He noticed the mending. He noticed the 3 books. He noticed the unlit lamp in the hall. He noticed the second cup by the fire, which was hers, from that morning, and the fact that there was no second cup meant for anyone else. He noticed her. He noticed her the way he had at 24, and she saw, with a slow and awful clarity, that he had never in his life stopped. Sit down, please, she said, because if he kept standing she was going to have to keep standing, and her back had been troubling her. He sat. He did not put his coat aside. She was grateful for that, too, since the room did not deserve a coat set down in it. "You said," she began, and then she had to begin again. "You said 11 months ago, you heard. May I ask from whom your cousin Lavinia," he said, "at a dinner." She did not know I was listening. White. She was telling a story about how her cousin's husband had died, and how her cousin, who had always been so silly and so soft and so large, had been left with nothing. And she was telling the story to make everyone laugh, because Lavinia has, as you know, an ear for what will make a table laugh. I sat through the entire story. And then I went home, and I sat in my library until 3 in the morning. And I have been, since then, a very useless man. She had known, in a way, that Lavinia would have told the story. She had not known Lavinia would have told it in front of him. She looked at her hands, which had grown, over the last year, red at the knuckles from mending in cold rooms, and she said without looking up, "Why did you not marry Julian?" It was the first time she had used his name aloud in 11 years. She heard him hear it. "Because," he said, "I had chosen already, and the choice had not chosen me back, and I had understood at 24 that I was not the sort of man who could take his heart out and put it into a second body and pretend. I am aware," he added in the same quiet voice, "that this makes me sound theatrical. I have been trying for years not to be theatrical about it. I have failed only twice. Once, in 1815, at a ball, when I saw you across a room with your husband, and I left before supper. And now—" Honora, who had prided herself for 18 months on not crying in front of anyone, cried once, quickly, and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand before he could see, and she saw him not see it, on purpose, which was worse. "You are not theatrical," she said. "You are only late." "Yes," he said. "I know I am very late. I am so late that I am terrified of asking anything of you now, because I do not wish, ever in my life, to look like a man who arrived at a widow's door with a purse the week her rent was due, and called it love. So I am not going to ask anything. I am going to state, and you will do, with the statements, what you please." He set his gloves on his knee, very carefully, one and then the other, as though the small precision of it were the only thing holding him upright. "One," he said. "Your mother's earrings will be back in that box by the end of this week, and they will remain in your keeping, regardless of what you decide about anything else. That is not conditional. 2. The rent on this house will be paid to the end of the year, again, unconditionally, because I cannot sit in this room and know it is cold and do nothing. 3. If, after some days, you find you can bear it, I should like to call again. Not as a duke. As Julian 4. He stopped. He looked at his gloves. He looked, at last, at her. 4. If, after some months, you find you can bear more than that, I have a house at Marwood that has been kept perfectly and inhabited by no one, and I have a name and a title and a life, and every part of that would like, very much, to belong to you. But 4 is a long way from tonight, Honora, and I have not come here to bargain. I have come to say the thing I should have said in 1813, so that you know it has been said, and so that the rest of your life, whatever shape it takes, is lived in a world where it has been said. Well, there. She could not for a long moment speak at all. Outside in Peel Terrace, a boy was calling the last of the evening papers, and getting no takers. The fire behind its piece of turf gave up entirely, and went out, unremarked. Somewhere in the house above them, a floorboard settled with the cold. "Julian," she said finally, "you cannot pay my rent." "I have already," he said, "written the note. It is in my coat. You may tear it up, but it is written. Because if you pay my rent," she went on, as though he had not spoken, then everything you have just said becomes a transaction. And I will not hear it again as a transaction. I have already been a transaction. I was Charles Ashcombe's transaction. I settled his mother, and I ran his house. And I bore patiently the fact that he did not love me, and did not in the end even respect me, and I was told, when he died, that I ought to be grateful for the years, because at my size a woman is fortunate to be married at all. I have heard Julian at least 200 times in exactly those words, that I am fortunate to have been married at all. He had gone very still. Fortunate to have been married at all. The words sat in the parlor after she had said them, and did not leave. I will not, she said, be fortunate again, not for you, and not for anyone. If I am to be anything to you, I am to be chosen, not rescued, chosen. And if what you meant, in that carriage, was rescue in a nicer coat, I would rather you left the note in your pocket and went home. He looked at her the way she realized he had looked at her across the ballroom in 1813. She had not then understood the look. She had been 22, and she had thought a man looking at her that steadily must be looking at something behind her, because she had been raised on the arithmetic that reduced her to the least interesting figure in every room. She understood the look now. Honora, he said, I have never in my life used the word rescue about you. Not in my thoughts, not in my letters, not in the 11 years of a life I have arranged around not touching yours. If you tell me to leave, I will leave, and I will find tomorrow some further and stranger way to be sure the earrings come back and the coal is delivered, without your knowing it was me. But I did not come here to lift you. I came here because I have been lifted all my life by knowing that you existed, and I have finally understood that letting you not know it was the cruelest and most cowardly thing I have ever done. Now listen. There are moments in a woman's life when everything she has taught herself to be by way of survival falls off her at once, like a coat too large and too warm, and she stands in the middle of a cold parlor in November and finds that she can, in fact, feel her own heart. Honora had one such moment. She held it. She did not let it decide for her. You will not, she said, and her voice was quite steady now, pay my rent. I will not, he agreed. You will send Mr. Peabody the price of the earrings, no more. That much I will accept, because they were my mother's, and because I do not think my mother, wherever she is, will forgive either of us if I let them go. I will pay you back. You will not, he said. But I accept your terms about Peabody. You will call again, she said. On Sunday, in daylight, through the front door, like a person, and you will not send anything ahead. Sunday, he said. Nothing sent ahead. Yes. And you will tell me on Sunday why you did not, in 1813, cross the room. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she saw, quite clearly, what the last year had done to him, and she saw, further back, what 11 years had done, and she was not, God help her, sorry for him. She was only at last sorry with him, which is different and rarer. I will tell you on Sunday, he said, if you promise me, Honora, that between now and Sunday you will eat. I will eat, she said. I am not sending a hamper. I am asking a woman I have loved 11 years to promise me she will not go to bed hungry tonight, because she is proud. I have half a loaf and a piece of cheese from the woman in Halliday Street, which I earned by taking in her linen, said Honora, and I have tea. I will eat, Julian. I have kept myself alive for 18 months. I do not intend to stop tonight, thank you, he said. And he stood, and he did not linger, which was of all the small acts of care he performed that evening, the one that undid her most, because a lesser man would have lingered. At the door with his hand on the latch he turned. "May I say one thing more?" "Say it." "The gown was pale green," he said. "You had a ribbon in your hair. Dark green. Tied badly. I remember it was tied badly, because I remember thinking I should like one day to be the person who tied it properly. I have never in 11 years thought of you in any other terms, Honora. Not once. I do not know how to be plainer than that." He went. The door shut. She stood in the cold parlor, with her hand on the back of the chair, and did not move for a very long time, and when she moved at last, it was to put the piece of turf back on the fire and to blow it patiently, until it caught, because a woman who has just been told, at 33 Sapter, Tafter, that she has been loved for 11 years, does not go to bed with a dead fire. Even a poor woman does not. She ate the bread, she ate the cheese. She sat by the small fire until it was down to embers again, and then she went upstairs. And she took, out of the drawer where she kept the last of her linen, a dark green ribbon that had been in a box with a great many other things she had not been able to bring herself to burn. And she looked at it a long moment, and she did not cry over it, and she put it back. The days between that night and Sunday were the strangest of her life. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. He did not send Probin. He did not call. On the Thursday, Mr. Peabody's boy came to the door with a small parcel done up in brown paper, and inside the paper was the cracked leather box, and inside the box the earrings, and a note, in Peabody's own hand, which said only, "Account settled by a friend of the family." He asked me to write it thus, no name, no flourish. Honora read it twice, and she set the box on the little table beside her 3 books, and she went on with the mending. On Friday the rent man came, and she paid him with the money she had earned from the linen, and it was not enough, and she said so. And he said he would come again on Monday, and she thanked him, and she did not send word. On Saturday she washed her hair. She had not, she realized, washed it properly in a month, because hot water was expensive, and one made do. She washed it. She brushed it out by the fire. She looked at herself in the little glass over the mantel, and saw a woman she had not for some time wanted to see, and she looked longer than she meant to, and she did not turn away. She was, if you will forgive the storyteller for saying so, a fine-looking woman when she troubled to see herself. She was broad and full and soft, and her face was round and quiet, and her hair was heavy and dark and brushed out, caught the firelight the way better women's hair was said to. She had not, in 11 years of hearing, that no man of rank would look twice at a woman of her size, ever quite believed that no man had. She had, however, believed that no man mattered. And Julian Marwood, arriving 11 years late in a pawnshop on Weatherby Lane, had made a bonfire of that belief, with one sentence about a badly tied ribbon, and she was, on the Saturday night, honest enough to sit with the fire and admit it. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and 11 years is a long time for a woman to have been kept unaware. And Honora was not going, on the Sunday, to open her door and fall into a story. She was going to open her door and ask her questions. He came at 3. It was for November, a bright afternoon, low sun through the chapel and a hard, clean wind. He came on foot. She saw him, from the upstairs window, walking down Peel Terrace like a man who had chosen to walk because he did not wish to arrive in a carriage he could not leave. And she came down slowly, and she opened the door herself, and she said, "Come in, Julian," and he came in. The parlor had a proper fire in it today. She had bought coal on Saturday, out of the last of her housekeeping, because she had decided she would not receive him in a cold room, even if it cost her Monday's bread. He noticed the fire and did not comment. He noticed the earrings on the little table and their box open, did not comment on that either. "Sit," she said. He sat, she sat opposite him. There was, between them, the small table with the 3 books, and the earrings, and a cup of tea she had made for him without asking, because she had decided in the night that if she was to have this conversation, she would have it as the mistress of her own house, however poor the house. 1813, she said. He did not pretend not to understand. "Your uncle's ballroom," he said. "The pale green gown, the ribbon." I did not cross the room because when I asked, quietly, of the man beside me who you were, he told me that you were the youngest Miss Vane, that you were promised to Charles Ashcombe, and that the settlement had been signed the week before. He told me this with a great deal of amusement, because he knew apparently that Ashcombe had signed it for the portion, and he thought it a fine joke that a girl of your size had been carried off by a man like that. I remember that I did not laugh. I remember that I did not, at that moment, cross the room, because I had understood in the same breath 2 things. 1, that I had come too late. 2, that if I crossed the room and spoke to you, and you had already been given, I would make a scene which would make the joke worse, and you would remember the ball as the night I made you notorious. He looked at his hands. I was 24, he said, and I did the honorable thing, and I have hated myself for it ever since, because the honorable thing turned out to have been the coward's thing dressed for dinner. I should have crossed the room. I should have made the scene. I should have taken you, Honora, out of that ballroom and out of that settlement, and married you at 22 before Charles Ashcombe could spend a farthing of your money. And I did not. I did not, and I have watched from a great distance what he did to you, with the years I gave him. And there is nothing I can do about it now, except sit in your parlor on a Sunday afternoon and tell you the truth. She had thought, over the week, that she would be angry when she heard it. She was not angry. She was tired, and she was sad, but she was not angry, because she saw, quite clearly now, that Julian Marwood at 24 had been the man his father had made him, and his rank had made him, and he had done what such a man would do, and no woman of 33 has the luxury of blaming a man of 24. "Julian," she said, "did you love me at 22? "I loved you," he said. "From the 3rd dance of the evening, which was not mine. I stood by the wall and watched you dance with Mr. Kettering, who did not know what to do with your hand, and I decided by the end of the set that I would ask you for the 4th, and I was on my way across the room when Lord Pomfret stopped me and told me you were promised, and then I made the coward's choice I have just described. So yes, I loved you at 20. I have loved you at every age you have been since. I did not stop when you married. I did not stop when he humiliated you at the theater, in 1816, of which I heard, and after which I nearly did cross the room, and I am sorry, again, that I did not. I did not stop when I was told you had lost a child, which I heard from your cousin in the same season, and after which I sat in my study for 2 days, and drank very badly. I did not stop when he died. I did not stop when I was told, at that dinner in January, that you were destitute. I have not stopped. I do not know how to stop, Honora, and I do not any longer wish to. She said, quietly. I did not know, he said, of the 2nd. I am sorry. The 1st was a girl, she said. The 2nd, they said, would have been a boy. Charles took the 2nd worse. He said I had failed him. He said, at the end, in the presence of his mother, that no man of proper feeling could have been expected to keep loving a wife who could not keep a child in her body, and his mother said, and I heard her, that at least I had turned out useful about the linens. At least the linens will be well kept. Julian was very white. He said nothing for a full minute. When he spoke, his voice was flatter than she had ever heard it. And it was, she understood after a moment, the voice of a man holding a great deal of feeling behind a small, careful door, because he did not have permission in her parlor to open it. "Honora," he said, "I would like, one day, to say aloud to Charles Ashcombe's mother what I think of her. I understand that she is still living. I am prepared to wait until you decide I may." "You may not," said Honora, and to her own surprise, she smiled, a small and dry and 11 years tired smile. "She is not worth the sentence. She is worth a bow at church and a passing over. I have learned, Julian, that the worst punishment for people of that kind is that no one remembers to invite them anywhere. She will die soon and unrecalled, and it will be a satisfactory punishment, and I will not at her funeral wear black." He laughed. It came out of him in a single startled breath, as though he had forgotten laughing was a thing he did. And Honora heard it, and something in her which had been braced for a decade, unbraced itself a fraction. "I have loved you at every age you have been," he said again more quietly, "and I love you at this one, and if you will let me, Honora, I should like, at whatever pace you like, to spend the age you are next in company with you. As Julian, in your parlor on Sundays, if that is all you can bear. As a friend who calls, if that is more. As, eventually, if you should ever wish it. And, I do not ask it today, my wife. I have said several times over now that I do not come with a bargain. I mean it. If Sundays in this parlor is all you can bear for a year, I will take Sundays in this parlor for a year, and I will count myself, at the end of the year, a better man than I have been." She looked at him a long moment. She looked at the earrings on the table, and at the fire she had bought with her Monday bread, and at the 3 books, and at Julian Marwood in his good gray coat that he had not, this time, taken off either. And she said, "Julian, take your coat off. The fire is decent. You will overheat." He looked at her. Then he looked at the fire. Then, quite slowly, as though the small permission were the largest thing that had happened in his life, he stood, and he took the coat off, and he laid it over the back of the chair, and he sat down again, and he was, in his shirt and waistcoat, a leaner and tireder man than his coat had made him. And Honora saw him with a kind of clean sight she had not had since she was 22, and she thought distantly that she had somewhere along the way been given back the ability to see a man properly. "Sundays for a while," she said. "Not a year. I do not have a year of Sundays in me, before I know what I mean. But some Sundays. And you may write. In between if you like. I should like to be written to." "I should like to write to you," he said gravely, as though she had offered him a treaty. "And Julian," she said, "the next time you send Mr. Peabody the price of a thing of mine, you will tell me first. I will not have you managing my affairs behind my back, however kindly. I have had a life managed behind my back. It has not agreed with me. I will tell you first," he said. "I will not do it again without asking. You have my word." "Good," she said. They sat a moment in silence. The fire did what a decent fire does, which is to make a room feel like a place a person lives in, and Honora, who had for 18 months been keeping herself alive in a cold room, felt for the first time that she was sitting somewhere. "May I?" said Julian after a while, and she saw that he was measuring the sentence carefully. "Ask one small thing. Ask, there was, when I came in last week, a ribbon on your dressing table upstairs. I saw it through the open door. As I turned to leave, it was dark green. May I ask whether it was the ribbon?" She had not known until that moment that he had seen it. She had not known that she had left the door open. She had, evidently, done both. "It was," she said. "You kept it. I kept it. Why?" "Because," she said. And now at last she found she could look at him without the whole ballroom of 1813 falling between them. At 22, I did not know what the look across the room meant. But I knew, whatever it meant, that I did not want to forget having been looked at that way. So I kept the ribbon. And I have on very bad nights over the years taken it out and looked at it, and I have not, before this week, allowed myself to know why. Julian did not speak. He did not, thank God, cross the parlor and take her hand, because if he had, she would have had to send him home. He sat where he was, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the small distance between them, which had been 11 years wide, became in the space of a Sunday afternoon only the width of a small table, with 3 books, and a pair of earrings on it. He came the next Sunday, and the one after that. He wrote in between. His letters were plain and careful and full of small news, and once, in the 3rd letter, of a sentence about a hymn he had heard at a village church which had reminded him of a hymn her mother, apparently, had sung at some public occasion he had once attended, and Honora read that sentence 3 times and put the letter in the box, with the earrings, because she understood by then that Julian Marwood remembered every small thing anyone he loved had ever done, and had spent 11 years carrying a great deal of her that she had not known he had. On the 5th Sunday she went to Marwood. He did not press it. She proposed it herself, because she had decided that if she was to know a man, she would know the house that had made him, and he sent a carriage on the Saturday morning with a note that said only, "Whatever hour suits. Bring your own cloak. Mine will be too fine and will make you cross," and she laughed aloud in the parlor reading it, and the neighbor above heard her laugh, and did not know why, but heard it. It was, come to think, the first she had laughed. Under that roof Marwood was cold. She had expected that. Great houses that had not had a mistress in a decade were always cold, and this one had not had a mistress ever, because Julian's mother had died when he was 6, and his father had never remarried, and the housekeeper, a Mrs. Larkin, who received her at the door, was so plainly relieved to be received in turn by a woman who knew what a linen press was, that Honora warmed to her within 10 minutes and to the house within an hour. Julian showed her without ceremony the library, and the small morning room that faced south, and a portrait of his mother, which he had not, he said, been able to look at for years, and which he had that week had cleaned. "Because I thought you might one day like to see her," he said, "and I did not want you to see her under dust." Honora looked at the woman in the portrait, who was slight and dark and unlike her in every way, and she said, "She has your mouth." And Julian said, "So I am told," and did not add anything, and the not adding was. Honora had come to understand how he loved. There was in the smaller drawing-room a card table set up with a book open on it, and Julian said, "I have been reading in there in the evenings, because my study is cold. If you would prefer another room, I will move." And Honora, who had spent 18 months in a parlor with 3 books, laughed and said, "Julian, I will not turn a man out of his own room because I have come to look at his house." Mrs. Larkin brought tea. Honora poured. She had not, in a year, poured tea for anyone she was not paid to pour it for, and her hand shook once, and she covered it by refilling the pot, and she saw Julian see the shake, and she saw him decide not to see it. He noticed the servant's tired hands. He noticed the housekeeper's careful uniform. He noticed the plate she took first. He noticed her. He noticed above all that she was tired, because she had come by carriage, in a cloak that was not warm enough, and he put his own coat over her shoulders when she stood at the window, without asking. And she did not, this time, refuse it. And she said only, "You will freeze, Julian. Half an hour more will not undo me." She went home that night to Peel Terrace, and she sat by her small fire, and she thought about the portrait of his mother, and about the housekeeper's face, and about the fact that at Marwood there was no child, and no ward, and no third party at all, and that the only person in that house who needed her was the man who had said he had been freezing for 11 years, and she thought, with a slow astonishment, that the stake in this story was not a child, and not an inheritance, and not a scandal. The stake was her. It was her heart. It was her right to be chosen. It was the 11 years of her life she was owed, and the 20 or 30 or 40 ahead of her, and whether she would spend them being fortunate to have been anything, or whether she would spend them being loved. She went to bed. She slept, for the first time in months, without waking at 3. Now the cruel of the world do not, in stories, sit quietly by. And I would not be an honest storyteller if I pretended otherwise. Lavinia Vane, cousin to Honora, and dinner-table wit, heard within a month that the Duke of Harrowmere was calling at a house in Peel Terrace, and Lavinia Vane, whose mouth had already once done Honora a great deal of damage, decided to do it a great deal more. She came, uninvited, on a Wednesday. She wore a bonnet Honora recognized, because it had belonged once to Honora's mother, and had been in the box of things Lavinia had come and picked over, the week after Charles was buried, on the grounds that Honora would not be needing them, being a widow of her size and situation. Honora saw the bonnet before she saw Lavinia's face, and she understood the visit in the same breath. "Cousin," said Lavinia, sweeping in. "Lavinia," said Honora, and did not stand. "I hear," said Lavinia, arranging herself on the chair Julian had used, "that you have been receiving the Duke of Harrowmere." "I have. On Sundays. On Sundays." "Honora," said Lavinia, and her voice took the particular shape it took when she was preparing to be, as she would have called it, kind. "You cannot possibly imagine he means anything by it." Honora did not answer. "He is," said Lavinia, "a man of great rank and great fortune, and he has all his life been eccentric about women, and you know as well as I do, that he has never married, and it is generally understood that he never will, and it is very good of him, no doubt, to take an interest in a cousin of mine who has fallen on hard times, but you must not, dearest, allow yourself to think it is anything else. You would be a laughing-stock. You would be worse than a laughing-stock. You would be the joke of the entire county. A man like that does not marry a woman like you. He simply does not. And I say this, Honora, out of the greatest affection, because I could not bear to see you humiliated a second time in your life." She had said it very well. She had rehearsed it, Honora thought, on the walk over. She had doubtless delivered pieces of it at 3 dinner tables already. He simply does not. Honora, who a year ago would have sat under this sentence like a stone under rain, sat under it now like a house with the door bolted from the inside, and she felt the words hit the door and slide down the door, and puddle harmlessly at the sill, and she thought quite clearly, which was, she realized, a first. "Lavinia," she said, "give me the bonnet." "I beg your pardon?" "The bonnet on your head. It was my mother's. You took it out of a box in this house 18 months ago, when I was not in a fit state to notice, along with a number of other things. And I have, since, made a list of them. I have the list upstairs. I will fetch it in a moment. But the bonnet, since you are wearing it, we will begin with. Take it off, please, and put it on the table." Lavinia stared. "Honora, do not be absurd." "I am not being absurd. I am being clear. Take off the bonnet, put it on the table, and I will tell you, one item at a time, what else you are to return to me by the end of the week. If you do not, Lavinia, I will call at your husband's club on Friday, and I will sit in the vestibule until he sees me, and I will tell him, plainly, that his wife has been living, for a year and a half, in objects taken from her destitute cousin. He is, as we both know, a man who cares very much about how a thing appears. He will not thank you for it." Lavinia's hand went involuntarily to the bonnet. "You would not." "I would," said Honora. "I would today. But I am giving you the week. There was a silence. Lavinia, who had come in on a wave of dinner-table certainty, found herself, for the first time in her life, in a parlor with a cousin who had apparently stopped being furniture. She took the bonnet off. She put it on the table. She stood up quite abruptly and she said, "You have changed, Honora." "I have not," said Honora. "I have only been visible again. It is different." Lavinia left. She did not shut the door quietly. Honora sat a long moment with her mother's bonnet on the little table beside the earrings, and then she got up, and she took the bonnet upstairs, and she put it in the drawer with the dark green ribbon, and she came down and made herself tea. She wrote to Julian that evening. She wrote, "Lavinia called. I made her give back my mother's bonnet. I will tell you the rest on Sunday. I find I did not need you, Julian, to do it. I want you to know I did not need you. I want you to know also that I am glad you exist." Those two sentences are, I think, both true at once, and I am learning to say them together. She sent the letter. She went to bed. She slept. He came on Sunday. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was by now his signature, and at the end he said, "I am proud of you, Honora, and I did not intend to say a sentence with the word proud in it because you did not do this for me. But I will not take the sentence back. You need not take it back," she said. They sat by the fire. He said after a while, "May I ask you something, Honora? And will you answer it? Not as a bargain, but as a question. Ask. Would you marry me?" He said it plainly, as he said most things, without ornament. And he did not this time offer any of the 4 points he had offered, in this same parlor, weeks before, because they had both of them moved past 4 points. He said it the way one says a plain thing between two people who have earned the plainness. She did not answer at once. She looked at him. She looked at the fire. She looked at the earrings on the table and at the space on the other side of the table, where she could, if she wished, imagine a life laid out. She thought of Marwood, and of Mrs. Larkin, and of the portrait of his mother. She thought of Peel Terrace, and of the 18 months she had spent teaching herself to feel nothing visibly in public, and of the fact that she had in the last few weeks begun to feel things visibly in this parlor, and had not died of it. "Julian," she said, "I would. But not yet. Not because I do not know. Because I want, for a little longer, to be a woman who is being courted. I have never in my life been courted. Charles bought me. My father sold me. I have never had a man on a Sunday afternoon in a parlor with a fire in it, who came only to see me. I should like, if you will bear it, another few Sundays of that. And then at Easter, if you ask again, I will say yes then, and I will mean it, and I will not wonder, ever, whether I said it because it was cold, or because the rent was due, or because I was tired." He was very quiet a moment. Then he said, "Honora, I have waited 11 years. I can wait until Easter. I would wait until the following one if you asked." "Easter will do," she said. He came every Sunday between that afternoon and Easter, and he wrote between, and Honora paid her own rent through the winter by taking in mending, and by, in February, being engaged by a lending library in the next street to keep their ledgers on Saturday afternoons, because the owner had come to trust her hand. And she wrote to Julian on the day she took the position and told him. And he wrote back, "That is the best news of my winter, and I mean it. You will keep those ledgers better than any man I have ever met. I love you, and I love that you will not need me to keep you." And she read the letter twice and put it this time not in the box with the earrings but into her work-basket, so that it lived where her hands lived. At Easter he asked again. At Marwood, in the small south-facing morning room, and she said yes, and she meant it, and she was not tired, and it was not cold, and the rent was that quarter paid. They married quietly in the chapel at Marwood in May. Mrs. Larkin cried. Mr. Peabody, invited on Honora's own insistence, came in a coat brushed for the occasion and gave her a small package, which turned out to be a garnet cross with the wrong initials on the back, bought back, he said, from the man he had sold it to, because he had felt bad about it ever since. Honora wore in her hair a ribbon of very dark green, tied, this time, properly, by a man who had wanted, for 11 years, to be the person to tie it. Lavinia was not invited. Lavinia heard about the wedding at a dinner in London a week afterwards, and she said very little, because there was, by then, very little to say. She was, over the following year, invited to fewer dinners, and then to fewer still, and eventually to none of the ones that mattered. Because it turned out that when the story of Honora Vane and the Duke of Harrowmere was told properly in a drawing-room, Lavinia did not come out of it well. Remembered which cousin had been kind and which had not, and adjusted itself accordingly. She died, as Honora had once predicted, unrecalled, and Honora at her funeral wore, as she had promised herself, a color that was not black. She wore, in fact, dark green. But that is later. The story ends earlier, on a summer evening at Marwood, in the second year of their marriage, when Julian came into the morning room to find his wife at the writing desk, working through the household accounts, which she had taken over from a steward who had, upon her arrival, quietly resigned in relief. And he stood behind her a moment and looked over her shoulder, and he said, "Mrs. Larkin tells me you have arranged for the linen presses to be aired every quarter, and that the cook is happier than she has been in a decade, and that the 2 housemaids you engaged from the village have already spoiled the entire staff for anyone who might come after you. She calls you, when you are not in the room, the mistress, which she has never called anyone in her life." Honora set the pen down. "Julian," she said, "come here." He came round the desk. She stood up. She put her hand against his face, which was, she noticed with a small, startled joy, no longer as thin at the temple as it had been in November, and she said, "You are not freezing any more." "I am not," he said. "Neither am I." He held her a long moment. It was, she thought, the plainest embrace in the world. There was nothing theatrical in it. There was nothing bargained in it. There was only a man and a woman who had, at last, understood that they had been chosen by each other, and that the choosing had been, in the end, worth 11 years and 1 bad ballroom and 1 pawn shop in Wetherby Lane. "Julian," she said into his shoulder, "if I had sold the earrings that morning, would you have come anyway?" "Yes," he said at once. "I would have come that afternoon. I had already written the letter I meant to send. It was in my coat. I had been carrying it for a fortnight, and I had lost my nerve every day. Peabody's boy was the reason I finally moved. I would have come. It might have taken longer. I would have come." "I am glad," she said. "You came that morning." "So am I." She kept the earrings, all her life, in the cracked leather box on her writing desk at Marwood, and she wore them, most often, when Julian was to be at